Okay, hello everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Peter Lundy for inviting me to this panel. And there should be a handout circulated online, however it's being circulated. So the tokens I'm going to be talking to you today about are the ones displayed on this slide. The first three in the main image were found in a pit behind the store of Attalus in the Agora and published by Homer Thompson in 1950. And the final token on the bottom right was found at the Dipylon Gate and published by Stefanos Koumenides in 1879. It's his drawing that you're seeing there. So all of Thompson's tokens were pretty uniform size. They're about 3 centimeters long and wide and about 0.8 centimeters thick. They're good ceramic fabric, show little sign of wear. Most strikingly of all, they have the single jigsaw edge, and they seem to constitute the upper or lower halves of what at one point must have been rectangular holes. And as you can see, they have writing on them. The middle one has Halamos on one side and Leo on the other. The first one on the left has Paul on one side and Leo less clearly on the other. And the last one here has Paul again on one side. And it's been suggested Ere, Epsilon, Rho, Epsilon on the other. And Koumenides recorded Xupataion on his token and nothing on the reverse. Although Thompson thinks maybe there was something written on the other side, but the paint has flaked. So on one side, there's a pattern here. On one side, these tokens have the names of Athenian tribes or abbreviations thereof, Leontis, Erecthes, written along the jigsaw cut. On the other side of them, they have references to demes, Halamos, Halamus, Xupate on one half, and on the other half, they have the mysterious Paul, which most scholars think stands for Politai, the sellers, which is a magistracy, a financial magistracy in Athens. And this is all part of what I'm going to be calling the standard theory about these tokens, which is that they were used to allot a particular set of magistracies. So here's the token plan for this talk. First, I'm going to lay out the standard theory at more length. Basically, as I say, these tokens are used to allot offices among the demes in a way that's proportional to the deme's size. I think this theory is basically right, so I'm going to then defend the standard theory against a few recent brief treatments of these tokens that reject it. Then I'm going to turn to issues of chronology. When were these tokens in use? How long were they used for? And that'll take me to the end of the talk today, where I'll touch on some issues of why these tokens were brought in, why they were discontinued, and what light all of this might shed on Athens' institutional change over the classical period. So, first up, the standard theory, as developed by Mabel Lang, E.S. Stavely, David Whitehead. I'm going to skate over the differences between them, give you one combination theory. Main stages of the procedure on the slide. Okay, to start with, there must have been some number of tokens large enough to allow them to be divided among the demes according to their balutic quotas, the set number of citizens that each of the demes sent to the Council of 500. So the most likely guess, I think, is that there were in fact 500 full tokens at the beginning. That's the same number of seats on the Council of 500, and that would have allowed it, that would have made it really easy to use balutic quotas for this purpose too. So the first step of the actual procedure was to write the names of the tribes across the middle of the tokens, with each of the 10 tribes ending up with its name on 50 of the tokens. Then they were cut in half with an irregular jigsaw cut. That's what a lightning bolt is on the slide. Probably we're not using a lightning bolt, but there you go. Then the tokens were thoroughly mixed around on a flat surface, the way you mix around pieces of a puzzle on a tabletop. Then they're turned over so that the side which was still blank faces up. The names of the offices being allotted are painted on the bottom halves of the tokens, while the names of the demes were painted on the top halves, with the number of top halves that were painted with the name of a particular deme corresponding to that deme's balutic quota. So, for example, Halamus would have been written on or Halamos would have been written on 3 of the half tokens. And these 3 half tokens would also have had half of the name of the tribe that Halamus was in, which is Leontis, written along the cut on their other sides. Then the tokens would have been fired. That's the flame sign. They're taken out of the kiln. They're turned over so that the names of the demes and offices face down. Only the names of the tribes are visible. Half names of the tribes. And these half names, along with the jigsaw line of the edge, they serve as a guide as the half tokens are pieced back together. But note the men piecing them back together don't know which deems are being paired with which offices on the other side of the tokens. Once all the tokens, half tokens, have found a partner, they're then turned over one last time, and they reveal which deems had in fact been paired with which offices, and hence which deems would fill the offices that year. So that's the standard theory, that these tokens were employed in the manner that I've just described to allot certain minor magistracies to deems. And as Mabel Lang suggested that these were one subset of magistrates mentioned in the passage from the Aristotelian treatise on the Athenian constitution. It's number 1 on the handout. And since this is asks, I guess I can just call it the Athpol, right? It's short for Athenian Politeia, the Athenian constitution. So as you'll see, that passage from Athpol tells us that a particular subset of the magistracies that were allotted, as opposed to the magistracies that were elected, they were distributed among the deems, deorunto estus demus. And that's the main point of our tokens in the standard theory, right? That they allow the offices to be distributed among the deems proportionally. Okay, so that's the standard theory and also the connection to the passage from the Athpol. And this brings us to the scholars who have recently dissented, or more recently, dissented from the standard theory. And they suggest instead that our tokens were private identification tokens or recognition tokens. And they would have been irregularly cut in half, as ours obviously were, and then the 2 halves would have been given to different parties. And a man could later identify himself to the other party by supplying the other half. Now, this seems to have been what happened with some so-called tesserae hospitales from the Roman world. And what you can see here is a 2nd century BC friendship token found near modern L'Aquila. Now, Gabriel Hermann suggested that our tokens had an exclusively private use like this, identification tokens, that they were identification tokens. And he suggested that they could have been passed down from fathers to sons so that the descendant of Zenoi, or guest friends, could present them and they could be sure who they were dealing with. Now, Sally Humphreys, for her part, agrees that our tokens weren't used to allot magistracies in the way the standard theory suggests, and she thinks they were instead used as recognition tokens as well. At the same time, though, Humphreys does think our tokens also had something to do with magistrates. And she thinks in particular our half tokens would have been given to men who had already been allocated an office by some procedure not using these tokens, so that these men could securely identify themselves when they went to central Athens to take up their position. So I think the main problem for Hermann and Humphreys' theories is that they fail to explain the presence of the tribal names. So in the standard theory, the tribal names would have allowed those running the procedure to know which half tokens to paint which deem names on the back of. Right? If you look at Leontis, you know you can write Helomus on the back of that one. And they would have also helped them to reunite the half tokens after they were fired. Since putting all the tokens with Leo written on them together, say, would have stopped them having to randomly try all the different combinations of the entire set of 1,000 half tokens until the pairs were found. In Hermann and Humphreys' theories, the tribal names are essentially unexplained. Whether we suppose the tokens were used to identify descendants of guest friends or Athenian magistrates, there's a need to explain why a tribal name would have helped with that. Now, Hermann, to be fair, did argue that the letters Leo and Ere were not, in fact, necessarily abbreviations of tribal names. And he even thinks Pol isn't necessarily an abbreviation for Politai, as the standard theory says. Instead, Hermann proposed that all of these abbreviations represent personal names. Now, the problem with this, I think, is that personal names are not commonly abbreviated in official contexts in Athens. In fact, they're nearly always written out in full, right? So in official inscriptions, that's the case, in strong contrast with the Roman practice. On allotment tickets or panakia, that's the case. On military tokens, like the ones studied by Kroll and Mitchell, have an example on the slide there. Even on the sherds used in ostracisms, again, here's some examples on the slide. By contrast, it looks like tribal names were occasionally abbreviated, and there are some examples of that on some of the lead tokens cataloged by Ioannis Sporonos, where we find Leo, we find Kek as well, probably short for Kekropis. And that actually makes perfect sense, because recognizing an abbreviation of the name of one of your city's 10 tribes, which were well known, would have been much easier than recognizing an abbreviation for a personal name, of which, of course, there were many. So there were tribal names on these tokens, and we need to explain them. The standard theory does. Hermann and Humphreys' theory doesn't so well. As for Humphreys, in particular, her skepticism about our tokens used to allot magistracies rests partly on a concern that, as she says, the assignation of offices to deems was known in advance, since the names of deems and offices were painted on the tokens before firing. So she's concerned that people would have known ahead of time, ahead of this process, which dean was going with which office, because someone would have had to write them on the half tokens. Now, it's true, of course, technically, that in the standard reconstruction, the names of the deans and the offices were painted on the tokens before firing. We can see that in the diagram. But that doesn't mean it was known in advance which deans would end up with which offices, since there was a mixing up process of the half tokens, and before the dean and the office names were written on separate halves, and nobody could have been able to trace exactly which deans which went with which offices before they were reunited. That's kind of the point of the process, that it's blind in that way. So if Humphreys is wrong about these tokens not being used in allotments, though, she may be right that they were used to identify incoming magistrates in one context. And in fact, there's a hint of this on Kumanudes' token, and that is the hole. A hole which must have been deliberately added when the token was produced, since there's no space, since space has been left for it in the writing. So in other words, no letter has been obliterated by the hole after the fact. So Herman may be right that this token may have been worn around someone's neck on a string. Now, why does only one of our tokens have a hole through it, if that was a thing, if that was a standard feature? And I would propose that this actually represents a slightly later development. So I would suggest that initially the tokens were produced without holes, just for use in the allotment procedure. Then the deans started to give the men who'd been selected for certain offices the relevant half tokens before they headed into the city center to take up their posts, to help them identify themselves. And once this became customary, it was decided to just make it easier for men to carry their tokens in this way by adding holes to them at the time that they were made. Anyway, that probably happened at the point that until the point that these tokens were taken out of circulation, and the whole procedure that they were part of was discontinued. So when did this happen? Let's go now to the issues of chronology. So Ath Pol, again on passage 1, in passage 1, seems to indicate that formerly, proteron, a subset of the allotted magistracies was distributed among the deans, but since the deans were selling their offices, these two they now allot from the whole tribe. That is, that's what they do now. The time the Ath Pol was written down, 330s or 320s. So there was a change from these magistracies being selected proportionally from the deans to them simply being selected randomly from the entire tribes without any attention being paid to which of the deans the men who took up the posts came from. And David Whitehead suggested that this change was associated with John Kroll's Class 3 allotment plates, some of which you can see on the slide. These were introduced at some point between 370 and around 362, and they were introduced to allow allotment machines or cleritaria to be employed in the selection of magistracies, as they had, of course, been employed from after 388 in the allocation of juries, in the allocation of jurors to courts. And we have a speech by Demosthenes from around 348 that includes a reference to bronze identification tickets being used in allotting counselors, archons, and other magistrates, passage number 2 on your handout. So these other magistrates mentioned by Demosthenes may well have been the ones that were once selected using our tokens, with an eye on having the deans represented proportionally, but which were now in the 4th century being selected from whole tribes using allotment machines and using allotment tickets. It looks pretty likely then that the minor magistracies we're talking about here were selected not by our tokens, but by allotment machines from the 360s on. But when were our tokens first used? So they go out of circulation by 360s at the latest. When were they first introduced? Well, we don't really know. It's impossible to say when they were first brought in. But when Thompson first published our tokens, the ones pictured here, he noted that they'd been found with a massive broken pottery of the second half of the 5th century, and that, along with the writing on the tokens, led him to date them to near the middle of the 5th century, quotation. We can also add that when the word proteron is used in the Ath Pol, as it is in passage 1, it tends to refer to the 5th century, before the great series of constitutional changes that occurred around the turn of the century. So both the tokens themselves, if we look at them, and the Ath Pol, seem to indicate that they were used in allotment procedures quite deep into the 5th century, maybe as far back as the middle of that century. So can we conclude then that our tokens were used in the procedure that we've outlined from the 450s or 440s all the way through to the 360s? Well, not if we follow Whitehead. So Whitehead thinks our tokens would have had a very short period of use, perhaps only a single year, he says. Or if we follow Humphreys, who thinks our tokens likely represent, as she says, an experiment that lasted at most for a few years. So why do they think this? In both cases, it's because so few of these tokens have been found. That's what Humphrey says. Whitehead puts it slightly more extensively. The problem is that the tiny number of Symbol tokens so far discovered in an area so extensively and intensively excavated as the environs of the Agora. Now, at this point, it's worth going back yet again to the passage from Athpole, number 1 in the handout. What I want to pick up on now is where this passage tells us the magistracies that were distributed among the demes were allotted. It tells us this was done in the Theseon. Now, since this is a talk to Asks, I probably don't need to tell you that this isn't the well-preserved temple in the Agora that was once thought to be the Theseon, right? We're now pretty sure that was the temple of Hephaestus. So where was the real ancient Theseon? We don't know for sure, but recent scholarship has tended to place it in to the north of the Acropolis and to the east. And that's at some distance from the classical Agora. So it's the green spot in the upper image, and it's the blue rectangle in the lower image. And in both cases, the classical Agora is at the top, further to the west, to the left of those images. Now, there are parts of the area near where we now think the Theseon was that have been excavated, but as a whole, that area hasn't been excavated anything like as thoroughly as the Agora. So, to my mind, this should soften our certainty that the low number of Jigsaw tokens that we found is an indication that only a few were ever produced, and therefore that these tokens were only in operation for a few years. In any case, Whitehead and Humphrey's suggestion might seem to have another problem facing it, and that is if the tokens we have are from the 5th century, as they don't seem to argue against, and allotment machines only started being used for the minor allotted matrices in the 360s, and our tokens were only used for a few years, there's a huge gap, right? So what was going on in the rest of the years between the 450s and the 360s? Now, both Lang and Stavely have alternative procedures that they describe. They say you can use beans, you can draw lots or beans from a container, and that could have been done instead. However, at some point our tokens were introduced, and I think this is probably for some reason. And why was this? And I would say that there were two, and this is consistent with what Lang says. First, our tokens made things more efficient. They allowed offices to be matched to demes in proportion to the deme size in a single procedure, which you can't do with lots and beans. And second, it made it harder for the offices that had been awarded to be sold, since it was now clear from pairs of half tokens which offices had been awarded to which demes. Okay, so this brings us to the final section of this short presentation, my mention of these offices being sold corruptly. And this is going to briefly touch on the issue of why these tokens were brought in and why they were taken away. So if we go back one final time to the passage 1 on the handout from Athpole, we'll notice that it says that at some point a change was made. Epede de polun hoi demoi. Now the imperfect there, polun, has usually been taken in the past to be inchoative, right? So the phrase is usually translated, since the demes began to sell their offices. But I think it actually makes more sense to take it as continuous, since the demes kept on selling their offices. Because as we've seen, our tokens were probably brought in the first place because of concerns about corruption. But they seem not to have been successful in completely stopping offices being sold. So then they were done away with because the demes kept on selling the offices. So who were the demes selling offices to? The answer is probably to other demes, maybe also to wealthy individuals in other demes. Why were these demes selling offices to other demes? Well, almost certainly because they decided that they'd rather have the money that was being offered than the power they could have had by holding these offices. And of course, power is probably something that was attractive to everybody involved. So the question here is really, why were some demes valuing money higher than others? And the answer to that as often is, some of them were probably poorer than others. And there's been research in the past decades by scholars like Nikolaos Papazarkadas that's made it really clear that demes did have different economic activities and different economic trajectories. And so they probably had different economic outcomes as well, right? So Claire Taylor has found that in the 5th century, wealthy political active citizens in Athens were significantly more likely to come from centrally located demes than is the case in the 4th century. So you look on the chart on the left, look how many wealthy politically active citizens come from her zone 1, which is centrally located demes. In the first chart, it's 58%, right? That's in the 5th century. If you look across in the 4th century, the number goes down to 31%. So it's much less dominated by a centrally located elite. It's hard to tell what causes this change, but I wonder, and I would suggest, I wonder if some minor contribution wasn't made by the shift first to the system involving our tokens and then to the use of allotment machines in the allotment of these minor magistracies. If, as Athpole suggests, deme selling offices was a major problem, it could be that our tokens, by making that form of corruption more difficult, made it easier for poorer demes to hold on to their offices. In the 360s, at any rate, as we've seen, the demes were completely taken out of the picture when it came to allocating these minor magistracies, with the offices now being allotted from entire tribes. And that was, again, probably to prevent corruption, not a bad thing, which was a bad thing in itself. But I'd suggest we should also see this as motivated by one of the Athenians' key values, and that is political equality. So Cleisthenes, who founded this classical Athenian democratic system, you can see on the slide, he made use of associations of civic subdivisions to help disperse power around the system. And that was something that was common in the construction of broad republican polis in the late Archaic period across the Greek world. But if Cleisthenes' newly constituted demes seemed like a good way of smoothing power around in the late 6th century, by the 360s they built up histories and trajectories of their own, the demes. And that, I would suggest, is partly what made the Athenians want to shift to having allotments done in the tribes or in the Phulae, because the tribes were civic subdivisions that cut across differences in geography and hence of wealth. So with the competition between unequal demes vying for influence out of the picture, it was easier for the offices to be made, for the allotments to be made on a truly random basis. Okay, so that's probably quite a lot of information for a 20-minute presentation, so I'll just close by summarizing some of the suggestions I've made. And I should acknowledge, by the way, that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants and studying these tokens, so these are just a few suggestions. First of all, I'd suggest that the standard theory is correct. These tokens were used to allot offices in the Thessaion, and if they were used to help identify people as well, that was only a later part of the same process. Second, I think we should be less certain than Whitehead was that the fact we only have 4 of these tokens means that the procedure they were involved in was only up and running for a year or two. Third, these tokens were both introduced and discontinued because of continuing concerns about political equality. So I would suggest the demes kept on selling their offices. And finally, it's just possible that the shift to Jigsaw tokens and then allotment machines in allotting these minor magistracies contributed in some minor way to the more egalitarian distribution of political power that Taylor finds for the 4th century. So in conclusion, it would seem that these obscure but fascinating and puzzling jigsaw tokens were a product of the Athenians' desire to solve the puzzle of political equality. And they were also, in the end, a casualty of that same desire. Thank you.